There is a massive error in how we think about the fall of empires. We often assume a great power collapses because it loses a single war or runs out of money. But in the early 1800s, China's Qing Dynasty wasn't just a country, it was the center of the world. It controlled nearly 1/3 of the human population. It had more gold, more land, and more people than any nation in Europe. It was a closed system, self-sufficient, proud, and untouchable. Yet, within a few short decades, this entire structure shattered. It didn't happen because of a sudden invasion. It happened because of a trade imbalance that turned into a social catastrophe. If you looked at China in 1800, you would see a nation that wanted nothing from the outside world. The emperor famously told the British king that China possessed all things in prolific abundance and had no use for strange manufactures. But the British had a problem. They were obsessed with Chinese tea, silk, and porcelain. They were sending mountains of silver into China to pay for these goods, and they had nothing to sell in return. The British Empire was bleeding cash, and its leaders were getting desperate. They needed a product that the Chinese couldn't say no to, something that would force the gates of the empire open from the inside. What they found was a specific trade strategy that targeted the very foundation of Chinese law and order. By the time the Chinese government realized what was happening, the silver that had built their palaces was flowing back out of the country at a terrifying rate. The economy didn't just slow down, it flipped. This is the story of how the world's most powerful empire was dismantled not by an army, but by a commodity that turned its own people against the state. Before we look at the first moves in this shadow war, tell me in the comments, do you think a modern country could be brought down by a single trade product today? To understand the collapse, you have to understand how the world traded before paper money was king. In the 18th century, silver was the only global currency that mattered. China was the silver sink of the world. Because they produced everything Europe wanted, especially tea, and bought almost nothing back, the world's silver supply ended up in Chinese vaults. This gave the Qing Dynasty incredible leverage. They set the rules. They told the British and the Dutch that they could only trade in one city, Canton, and only through a small group of authorized merchants. The British East India Company was the most powerful corporation in history, but in China, they were treated like minor shopkeepers. They were forced to pay in silver bullion for every leaf of tea. By the late 1700s, the British were facing a national financial crisis. They were buying millions of pounds of tea every year, and their silver reserves were disappearing. If they didn't find a way to stop the silver from leaving, their own economy would face a total meltdown. They tried to send diplomats with clocks, telescopes, and carriage parts to impress the emperor, but he wasn't interested. He saw their technology as toys and their diplomats as barbarians. That's when the British shifted their strategy. They realized that if they couldn't sell a physical good to the government, they would sell a need to the people. In their colonies in India, they began mass-producing a specific type of processed poppy, opium. It wasn't a new product, but the British turned it into an industrial-scale weapon of trade. They didn't sell it through the official channels in Canton. Instead, they used a network of smugglers and corrupt local officials to flood the Chinese coast. They weren't just trading a product, they were bypassing the entire legal and economic structure of the Qing Dynasty. The impact was immediate. For the first time in history, the flow of silver reversed. Instead of silver coming into China for tea, silver started leaving China to pay for opium. The silver trap had been sprung. The Chinese government, which relied on silver to pay its soldiers and keep the market stable, suddenly found its currency vanishing. The price of silver inside China began to skyrocket. This meant that ordinary farmers who earned money in copper but had to pay taxes in silver saw their tax bills double or triple overnight. The British had found the one thing that could break the Qing's economic armor. The economic drain was only the first layer of the disaster. As the British expanded their smuggling operations, the product itself began to rot the social fabric of the country. Unlike tea or silk, which were luxury items that stayed at the top of society, opium moved downward. It started with wealthy merchants and board officials in the port cities, but it quickly spread to the very people the empire relied on for its survival: the soldiers, the laborers, and the low-level government workers. By the 1830s, the Qing government estimated that millions of people were using the drug. This created a massive productivity crisis. In the army, units that were supposed to be the elite defenders of the coast were found to be physically unable to march or fight. In government offices, the wheels of the state ground to a halt because officials were more interested in their next shipment than in collecting taxes or maintaining the dikes along the Yellow River. The empire was losing its ability to function, and the British were there to watch it happen. The British merchants justified this by calling it free trade. They argued that if the Chinese people wanted to buy a product, the British had a right to sell it, but this ignored the fact that the trade was built on a foundation of corruption. To get the drug into the country, the British had to bribe thousands of Chinese officials. This created a culture of dishonesty that ate away at the government's authority. When the law is for sale, the people lose respect for the state. The Qing Dynasty, which had ruled for centuries through a strict moral and legal code, was now seen as weak and hypocritical. The crisis reached a breaking point in the capital. The emperor's own family was not immune to the problem. He realized that if he didn't act, he would soon be the ruler of a bankrupt nation with an army that couldn't hold a spear and a government that only served the highest bidder. He had two choices: legalize the drug and try to tax it, or launch a total war against the smugglers. He chose the latter, appointing a man known for his absolute honesty, Lin Zexu, to go to Canton and end the trade forever. This decision would set off a chain of events that led directly to the first major war between the East and the West. In 1839, Commissioner Lin arrived in Canton with a clear mandate: destroy the trade or face execution. He didn't just target Chinese dealers, he went after the British directly. He surrounded their warehouses and forced them to hand over 20,000 chests of opium, which he then dissolved in massive pits of lime and seawater. To the Chinese, this was a lawful act of drug enforcement. To the British, it was an attack on private property and an insult to the crown. The British Navy, the most advanced force in the world, was dispatched to retaliate. The Qing army, once the terror of Asia, was still using bows and wooden ships against British ironclad steamers. The gap in power was no longer just economic. It was a total military mismatch. The war was a disaster for the Qing. British steamers moved up the coast, bypassing forts and destroying the wooden fleet with ease. In 1842, China was forced to sign the Treaty of Nanking. This wasn't a peace treaty, it was a surrender. China had to pay 21 million silver dollars for the destroyed opium and the costs of the war. They had to open 5 new ports and give Hong Kong to the British. Most importantly, the British demanded extraterritoriality, meaning their citizens were no longer subject to Chinese laws. The emperor's rules no longer applied in his own land. The empire's borders were open, its treasury was empty, and its legal authority was broken. The treaty did not bring peace. It brought a slow, agonizing decline. With the government's prestige shattered and silver continuing to drain out of the country to pay for war debts, the internal pressure became unbearable. This economic misery fueled the Taiping Rebellion, a civil war that lasted 14 years and claimed 20 million lives, more than the total deaths of World War I. While the Qing fought for their lives against their own people, the British and French launched a second Opium War to extract even more concessions. By the time the smoke cleared, the empire was a shell. Foreign powers carved China into spheres of influence, and the central government lost the ability to collect taxes or enforce laws. In 1912, the 267-year-old Qing Dynasty finally collapsed. It wasn't destroyed by a single battle, but by a half-century of economic and social erosion started by a trade product the empire couldn't control. The story of the Qing is a warning. When an empire loses control of its currency and the health of its social order, no wall is thick enough to keep the world out.